all. But other people are tired of hearing about Khashoggi, not because they want to turn a blind eye on the corruption of the Saudi government, but precisely because they don't want to turn a blind eye on it all. I'm sorry, but finding Khashoggi's body in the garden of the Saudi Consul General's home isn't this groundbreaking story for a country that beheaded 48 people in the first 4 months of 2018 and is seeking to behead a woman activist for speaking out against the government. This article is from late August. And the only reason that unprecedented is in that headline is because women usually don't receive the death penalty, apparently. But don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of capital punishment under specific circumstances. But these are people executed for non-lethal offenses like drug-related crimes. Not to mention Saudi Arabia has Sharia law. So when the media asks Trump if he'll halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, that's an obviously loaded question. I mean, what would make far more sense to ask is not, will you halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia in the wake of Khashoggi's death at the hands of someone close to the crown prince? The question should be, why are Western nations legitimizing tyrannous, and by an extension of that, oppressive regimes, such as Saudi Arabia and China? And what do you feel the best solution to all of that is? Because the best solution is not necessarily to just stop accepting money and products from these countries, but that's what the media should be asking, and there's a decent answer to it that I'll get to here soon, but first let me just explain something. The only reason that market prices for some goods are so low and why the West is exporting low-skilled jobs are because the extra value that you don't have to pay for some goods is extracted from the slave labor that makes it. And that's not to villainize the West, because we have cheaper medical supplies and other technology that not only makes our lives substantially better, but acts as a catalyst for technological development and innovation that can then be exported to the rest of the world. And since cheap products are more China's specialty, that statement's really more tailored towards China and other less popular slave labor countries like Indonesia, Vietnam. But we've been supporting Saudi Arabia since the 30s, but the modern relationship is more since like 1945. And it's because they supply us with oil, and they're a nice strategic partner to have in the region. That is, when they actually act as a partner and not as an enemy. And the advantage for Saudi Arabia in all of this is largely the stability of the West, where they've invested heavily. And it's not like Saudi Arabia was more Western in the 30s or the 40s. I mean, they've been ruled under an Islamic absolute monarch for quite some time. Flashback to when Obama was meeting with Saudi leaders and he offered them $115 billion in weapons. That's more than any previous U.S. administration. And if I was going to cover the Bush administration in Saudi Arabia, I'd be here for a long time. But none of this friendliness was at all diminished under Bush before Obama even arrived on the scene. And I have no problem with someone meeting with these leaders. I'm not chastising Obama for that, even though the media's hypocrisy is palpable. I mean, they act like Trump is committed to Saudi Arabia's crown prince, but Trump only offered them $12.5 billion in arms, about 11% of what Obama offered. I understand that there is industry built around this, and war is a profit machine, but where was the media when these bombing campaigns were going on under Obama? Where were the questions on cutting off money and supplies to Saudi Arabia every time that they murder a journalist or an activist or someone committing a non-violent crime? I mean, sure, I'd love to see arms sales to Saudi Arabia halted, and I'd love to watch the military-industrial complex shrink, in theory, but that's not how the arms market works. If the U.S. stops supplying Saudi Arabia, they'll get mad and will lose an ally in the region, and then they'll just get those arms from someone else. And then another country, likely at odds with the U.S., will begin getting extra revenue. And sure, Merkel has already cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but Germany's economy is doing worse than Kenya's and Uganda's. So Merkel's administration hasn't made smart economic moves up to now, but surprisingly, Macron has said that France is not cutting sales to Saudi Arabia. And he was irritated by the question. And the reason, I believe, is the same reason that Trump thought it was ridiculous to cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Because the people in the media asking the question know close to nothing about how a country should be run, but they want the leaders to make emotional and impulsive decisions based on a trending news story. Now, the answer to the question that I posed a little while back about how the West is legitimizing tyrannous and oppressive regimes is that if you were going to try to cut these countries off, you need to make sure that the vacuum in the market is gone. Make sure there is no one else that they can get arms from. Of course, this would require all of the rest of the world to agree to not sell or support certain countries just despite the regimes. This would never possibly work, as demand would go up, supply would go down, and then the price willing to be paid would go up to a point that the weakest link in the chain would break the entire process of letting certain regimes just crumble under their own weight. All it takes is one country to break the deal and do business with these regimes, and they're suddenly propped up by outside forces. So, what's the pragmatic solution to all of this? Well, maintain peace by being ready for war. You can't guarantee everyone else won't attack you, but you can guarantee that they'll be terrified to do it. That's called strength at home. Refusing to sell arms to some less established or tyrannous regime is okay too, because they likely wouldn't be in power on any timescale large enough to affect your more established country. But refusing to sell arms to an established regime like Saudi Arabia or China or Russia, they'll just get them from somewhere else. I mean, there'll be plenty of places looking to make money by selling arms to a huge military superpower. And I mean, you'd rather have that income flowing to the US or the West in general, as opposed to a Middle Eastern nation harboring terrorists or another world superpower vying for a monopoly on global force. So at this point, it's all a balancing act. But to answer the question posed in the title of this video, does Khashoggi's death matter? The answer is yes, but only as another name on a long list of those murdered by a corrupt regime using a backwards legal system. I mean, this isn't a news story, which is why I made this video more about the ridiculousness of the media. But the real news story to come out of this is reported over at Liberty Blitzkrieg, which references a few other news articles, and it's titled, U.S. Media Refuses to Inform the Public When Its Commentators and Pundits Are Paid Foreign Agents. He talks about the Washington Post allowing Saudi lobbyists to write opinion pieces, and how Glenn Greenwald exposed mass media regularly inviting on foreign agents to discuss foreign affairs without disclosing they're actually foreign agents. The article also talks about David Rothkopf, who's a foreign agent of the UAE and is written for the Daily Beast and received a platform from MSNBC, PBS, and CNN while receiving $50,000 per month. Greenwald also discusses Dennis Ross, Fran Townsend, Jack Keane, and Al Motor, who all have a financial interest in the Saudi regime. In the Intercept article, Glenn Greenwald notes how these Gulf monarchies and defense contractors are good at getting skilled and proficient people in front of the mass media to push their agenda. I mean, he says if the media was completely honest, there would be no market in the mainstream media for these corrupt nations to push their agenda. The last bit of the article here touches on the Middle East Institute receiving $20 million in 2016 from the UAE to renovate their headquarters. And then $1.25 to $4 million was received between 2016 and 2017 from Saudi interests. Then it gets into Michael Petrozello, who was a member of the Middle East Institute board and took on the kingdom as a client after September 11, 2001. His communications firm also reported $6.3 million in Saudi lobbying money in 2016 and 2017. Petrozello was also one of the organizers of a Saudi campaign to trick veterans into opposing a bill that would otherwise allow 9/11 victim families to sue the Saudis for their well-documented connection to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So you have the media saying, why won't Trump and Macron cut off these arms deals with Saudi Arabia? But they turn a blind eye on other media personnel. And it might not even be purposefully done, but arms sales to Saudi Arabia are the low-hanging fruit in all of this. I mean, a lot of these major outlets don't have to look beyond their own staff to find Saudi money that they could cut. But will they? I doubt it. And I also think that some of the push to get Trump to split ties with Saudi Arabia is to make the U.S. job market look worse right before midterms, or at least be projected to look worse. I mean, losing out on millions in revenue will mean that some defense contractors aren't producing as much, so their workforce can be decreased. So that's all for this video. I hope that you found it informative and helpful. Patreon, donation, and